This podcast was brought to you in association with Bloomsbury, India. Hello and welcome back to yet another episode of the Kitabi Karwan podcast. Today we'll be interviewing Kamal Gupta, the author of Play It Right, the man who beat the odds on Wall Street. It's a lofty title, but he deserves it. From one of the most interesting books that I've read in a really long time. Kamal Gupta studied at IIT Delhi, went on to the US for a master's degree, got a job, quit it to become a professional blackjack player, gambled his way for the next 3 years professionally, earned himself a living, on a whim decided to apply to Wall Street, got into Lehman Brothers, and was in the industry for 20 years before he retired after launching one of the largest hedge funds in history of Wall Street. This is a super interesting book and by far something that all of you should read. Without giving anything away, let's jump right into the interview.
Welcome to the Kitabi Karwan podcast,
Okay.
Kamal. It's absolutely lovely to have you here on the podcast, Kamal. This is one of those rare seasons where I'm talking to a lot of people about finances, and your book was absolutely a supremely interesting summary when I read it, the blurb of the book, and I knew I had to read the book, and it's absolutely a brilliant one. Very inspiring, to be very honest, because personally for me, what I've encountered and what I encounter with a lot of people who read biographies, they're very inspirational, or when you read life stories. But your story seemed a lot more relatable as someone who grew up in India, or something as basic as what you went through at Springdale's, right? Things like that are
Right.
far more relatable for people. So, Kamal, before we jump into the conversation, I would like to give you about 30 seconds to a minute to just talk about the book to our audience. Can you just tell us what your book's about, what you intended to achieve, why did you write it?
Hi, Siddharth. It's great to be here. The book is essentially about my journey from first from India to America, then from computers, where what I came to America to study for, into professional gambling, and I'm sure we'll talk about that as the time goes on. And then, in a remarkable turn of events, my gambling abilities landed me on Wall Street, which is where I stayed for almost a quarter century. So essentially, it's a journey from India to America to gambling to Las Vegas to New York on Wall Street, where along the way I encounter untold number of hurdles, and it's a story of how I managed to overcome these and beat the odds, not only in casinos and on Wall Street, but also in life itself, as you will read in the book.
Mhm. Well, and I'm glad you framed it that way, Kamal, because you mentioned it as a surprising turn of events. But I would actually want to probe you on that because
Okay.
many would argue that, well, professional gambling is the other side of Wall Street, right? It's just it's synonymous. So, having been someone who's explored both worlds properly, and you've genuinely been a professional gambler, not someone like, say, I mean, I know I like to play poker on the side, but I'm not professional at it at all.
Right.
What has your experience been? Because I mean, when I was reading your book, my understanding, which I walked away with, was that your approach to gambling was just as methodical, which say any person on the Wall Street might have with regard to any security. You had a strategy in mind. You read. You improved your game. You used strategies to make it better, right? So, do you think there is a difference in your journey in between the two, in these two journeys?
Yeah, it is. I mean, the reason I call it an extraordinary turn of events is twofold. First of all, we're
Mm-hmm.
talking about an environment in the late 80s and early 90s where Wall Street was populated by the likes of Gordon Gekko, the movie Wall Street, about greed is good, and Ivan Boesky and Michael Milken, who were all basically well known criminals.
Mm-hmm.
And sitting in San Francisco from afar, to me, Wall Street was a den of thieves.
Mm-hmm.
And I just could not imagine being a part of the greed is good crowd. And at that time, the relationship between late 80s, I mean, today people talk about Wall Street being gambling, but in late 80s and early 90s, people didn't really feel that way. There was a very small group of people who thought maybe there was a
Right.
correlation between gambling skills and managing money on Wall Street. And one of them, fortunately, happens to be the guy who interviews me at Lehman Brothers. And he was a poker player, so he decides to give a blackjack player a chance. But not only did I not want to work on Wall Street, I had actually taken a vow to never work on Wall Street because of how I felt this culture of obsession with money, which, by the way, all my fears about that were realized when I showed up here. So I didn't want any part of it. But then I read a few books and I found out there is a mathematical component to this industry.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the only reason why I sent a resume to a couple of investment banks. And I never thought I would get hired because, I don't have a business background. Why should a professional blackjack player get a job on Wall Street? And by and large, there was only one individual who was willing to take a chance. Everybody else that I spoke to just said, we don't know who you are. We don't know how to evaluate your skills. We don't know if you'll be a fit here or not.
Right.
But, in life, it only takes one person to take a chance on you. Right. And doors can open. And that's the chapter 1 of the book where, I'm grilled on my gambling prowess, and made to submit to a public test of my card counting skills. And luckily it works out. So, and I get hired. And so it's a combination of the times that we were living in the late 80s and early 90s, and my propensity to just my desire to just stay as far away from Wall Street as possible. There were a few other vows I made, which I'm sure you're familiar with, that also get broken in the book. But this
pretty
was
soon, actually. Pretty soon, actually, also.
Okay.
But Kamal, just before I jump to the next question, a quick bypass. Are you still as involved with blackjack? You did mention that your heart wasn't in it when you took that break from Wall Street and you tried at your hand at blackjack. And are you still as skilled at it, or is it just something?
No, I'm not, because it's funny. Someone asked me this question yesterday about playing blackjack, and I how good are my skills today as opposed to 30 years ago? And I think I replied that, why don't you ask Usain Bolt how many seconds it takes to run 100 meters 30 years from now? So I said, no, my skills have definitely atrophied. And more importantly, I realized 2 years after coming to Wall Street that I really had lost interest in blackjack and in gambling. And this has been actually a theme throughout my life, that I get obsessed with something. I throw myself completely in it. But then one day I move on, whether it's computers to blackjack. I had lost interest in computers before that, actually, even. Then from blackjack, I ended up on Wall Street unintentionally. But then I realized over the next 2 years, I didn't really care about blackjack anymore. I was sort of trying to figure out how to fit in this world of high finance, where I was a complete fish out of water, and the last place I had ever thought I would be. Right. So, I sort of was focused on this, and then, believe it or not, so I leave the financial industry in 2019 to write this book. And all my friends that I've known throughout my 27 years on Wall Street are shocked when I tell them I really don't have any interest in finance anymore. All my time and effort these days is devoted towards working on book 1, which is complete now, and possibly a book 2, and writing other things. So I feel like my brain, as I've aged, has sort of morphed from the whole mathematical bent that it had, 10, 20, 30 years ago, to a brain which I think right now is only suited for writing stories, which is fine.
And lucky us. If this book came out of it, it's a fantastic switch. But Kamal, I'll just step a bit back in your life tale, back to the Wall Street conundrum, right? So you did mention that it was one of the vows you broke, that you never wanted to work on Wall Street. You never identified with the values of Wall Street. If I could just, maybe it's not the most accurate of phrases.
No, that's accurate. That. Yeah.
Right. So, and again, this comes not from a space of judgment, but out of curiosity, right? Because all of us experience this in life, wherein we end up doing things which not necessarily fit well with our value system. You said the financial bits of Wall Street really appealed to you and made you realize that it's something you would work with. But
the mathematical bits, not the financial bits.
Oh, apologies. Yeah, that's what I meant. The mathematical bits that appeal to you. Correct. But still, the underlying values remain the same. So how did you go about this moral conundrum? Did this bother you? And if it did, what was your way of addressing it? Because the mathematical model just made the game a bit fairer, but the underlying values of Wall Street still remain the same from what you understood, or and even largely from a lot of your experience, particularly in the earlier days at Lehman Brothers with the MBS department, where you were structuring and selling them. You do speak about your how bad you felt about that structure you made in 1993.
Yeah.
Right. So, what was the way you reconcile this, if at all? If you manage to. I reconcile. A lot of people feel
it is, and it's actually a great question, because it's a real conundrum about how do you follow a moral arc in an industry that is fundamentally immoral? I mean, and is fundamentally obsessed with making money and at all costs and at the fastest, in the fastest manner possible. So the way I did it was to first spend 7 years obsessing over a methodology. Because unlike Blackjack, which you can pick up books to read about how to play the game, there's no such thing for financial markets. Anyone who understands these markets and how to beat them will never write a book. So I didn't even try reading any books. So I had to try and figure this out from first principles and from scratch, all by myself. And again, not surprisingly, it took me 7 years. I mean, and 7 years is a very long time to spend on one problem. And I think most people will not have the patience to stay with it or the perseverance. But I did. And then once I had the method, I decided, and this is why the book is called Play It Right, I would only play the game in a manner such that the odds are in my favor. Yes, I understand I have to make money to prove that I'm winning at the game, but money is merely a side effect of a game played well. It's not my primary objective. It has never been my primary objective, not in casinos, not on Wall Street. So I've played the game in a very strict fashion where I thought, the idea was to play the game in a proper way. So that you would come out ahead in the long run. The short run never mattered to me, which is the dramatic opposite of how people deal at investment banks and hedge funds. It's about making as much money as quickly as possible. So my thing was to separate myself from the whole industry, even though it's like an insider-outsider, conundrum, because I'm sure you're familiar with what a Mobius strip is,
Yes.
and in my second book, I actually have a line about, I'm confronting the system from the inside while retaining the perspective of someone who's always on the outside. And something like about this Mobius strip like existence, it's hard to know where the inside ends and the outside begins. So, but I stayed despite numerous invitations and threats and cajoling to deviate from my method, to take a lot more risk, to venture into other areas of the market which were more risky. I stayed true to my method for 20 years from 1999, which is when I started managing money for hedge funds, till 2019. Not once did I deviate from what my chosen method was, which was to the great frustration of every boss I've ever had. Because my performance, thankfully, was good enough for them to just ask me to take more and more risk. And I just wouldn't do it. I mean, because the only incentive they can offer you from deviating from your game plan is that you'll get paid more. Now, let's say you don't have any interest in that. You just want to play the game well and for the longest time possible. Then, and this is the line from the book, which I think will shock a lot of people, is in an industry where everyone tries to make the most amount of money in the shortest amount of time, I've always tried to make the least amount of money that would allow me to keep playing the game for the longest amount of time possible. And I did the same in Blackjack. The idea was never to make the most amount of money. The idea was to find a happy medium between, sleeping well at night, not getting thrown out of casinos, and still making enough of a return on capital.
Right. And it's an interesting idea to extrapolate, not just for Wall Street or Blackjack. That I think for a lot of people, often they look at life choices as dichotomies, right? Either you play the game, either you chase after money and high money in one situation, or you don't play the game at all. And very few people tend to look at the sustainability bit of it, doing things which actually lets them sustain the game for a little bit longer, right? Doing things that lets them last longer. And it's regardless of fields, right? It might be for employment like that. I am a lawyer by education, so I have a lot of friends who work in law firms, right? And they're just as bad in India as they're in the US in terms of their work culture and their work hours.
Yeah.
And again, that idea of, and again, the exact same reasoning that you gave, that your boss can offer you, the only incentive they can offer you is, well, you'll get paid more. So, work 20 hours a day for me. And very, very few people actually manage to take a step back and assess the grander thing and look at sustainability of the field, enjoying it for what it is, playing the game for the game rather than money. So that's a very interesting takeaway I can have from your story.
Well, I've always had this bent, but I mean, it was really made very stark for me on Wall Street. I mean, firstly, in casinos, right? In the 2.5 years I spent in casinos, I saw all sorts of like bad behavior. I mean, not directed at me, but just in general. I mean, casinos are a uniquely depressing place because, I mean, the whole edifice is built on people's losses. So, I mean, by and large, people will lose money, notwithstanding the odd winner here and there. So if you look around the faces at a poker table or even a blackjack table, yeah, there's some squeals of delight here and there, but by and large, it's a sad place.
Right.
And Wall Street, the interesting thing is this obsession with money, which obviously I had dealt with a lot of this in the casinos, and I never subscribed to that in Las Vegas. And I'm not going to subscribe to it in Wall Street either. I was here to play a new game, a different game, right? But the whole obsession with money, was just really shocking for me to observe, because that's basically the reason for a Wall Streeter's existence. Like, I have a line in there where an average trader's life was 364 days of fear and greed, followed by 1 day of ecstasy or even greater disappointment. And I thought that was like just no way to live. I mean, if you just take a step back and think about what makes you happy in life, right? I mean, and I can tell you one thing, money does not buy happiness. I've known some incredibly wealthy people in my life, and I can attest from firsthand experience, it has not bought them happiness. I am firmly of the belief that beyond a certain point of money not only does not buy you happiness, it may actually subtract happiness from you. So the question is, I mean, in my life, and I hope it applies to others, but maybe it doesn't. But at least it definitely applies to me. And this is the whole arc in the book, is that to me, the key to happiness lay in playing the game well during the day and sleeping well at night. Now, this sounds like a very simple statement, but if you just take the second half of that sentence, right, sleeping well at night, I don't think a thief sleeps well at night. I don't think someone who cheats others sleeps well at night. So I don't think someone who takes too much risk in their position sleeps well at night. So not only is there a peace of mind component to that, there's also a significant moral component to that. Like the fact that I can sleep well at night means that I haven't done any evil during the day. I mean, it's an important part of the story. And in the first half of playing the game well, it's not only from a methodology standpoint, such that the odds are in your favor and you will come out ahead, because the whole point of playing blackjack or financial markets is to beat the market or to beat the house, right? So, you have to play a game in a manner, like you said, sustainable, that can last for a long period of time. And because in the short term, anything can make money. And I actually have a line in the book, I don't know if you remember, where I'm arguing with a large money manager and they're pointing to their flawed methodology as the reason for their profits. And I said, yeah, of course, 2 + 2 = 5 will often make you a lot of money in markets. So in the short run, the wrong method can absolutely win. But in the long run, the true odds will always be realized.
Right. No, and it's a very interesting point you made about the moral choice, right? About sleeping well at night. It just reminds me of this really popular quote from Narayan Murthy, one of the most famous entrepreneurs India has produced, that a clean conscience is the best pillow, right? And
it's the same idea,
right? It's the exact same idea, and I think I think this is a very interesting takeaway I had from your book, because and if I just keep the Wall Street bit aside, right, a lot of your life journey has been espousing this principle that you've chased things that have made you happier rather than probably which made the best financial decisions.
I have never chased popularity, for instance. Like, I've never chased social acceptance. Like, playing blackjack was socially abhorrent. I mean, they all come around eventually, because I have a line in the book where experience has taught me that the world hates a gambler, but they love a winner. So it's a real contradiction if you happen to be the rare gambler who wins. So, but yeah, initially, I was subject to a lot of laughter and ridicule, like professional gambler. I mean, you're just using your, probability theory to justify your addiction. I said no, and after a while, I just stopped arguing. So, I mean, you just have to do what you have to do. I mean, and if people like it, great, and if they don't like it, I mean, as long as you're following, a moral path, it doesn't matter what other people think.
Right.
You know, I mean, their approval and disapproval are both irrelevant.
Right. Kamal, I had a question in mind that, you know, both of your journeys in Blackjack and on Wall Street were somehow trace their root in a book. Like you read a book which kind of
Yes.
transposed you to working towards them. And I can see you have a very good library right at the back. So can you describe a
And they
bit of
end
your
in a
relation?
book also, play it right. I mean, it's like,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So can you describe a bit of your relationship with books? Have you been reading all your life? Or what do you see reading as a hobby, as an, I don't know, skill enhancing activity? Is this something that you have to get through or succeeding at life, or do you enjoy it? Like, I don't know.
I was always an obsessive reader, like
Hmm.
especially when my high school years. I mean, I lived in this neighborhood in New Delhi called New Rajendra Nagar, and there was a library a few miles away, and they would let you take out only 2 books at a time. You
Okay.
know, so I would go in the morning, take out 2 books, and try to finish them during the day, and try to go back in the evening so I could get 2 more books. I mean, and I'm like 12, 13, 14 years old, so my parents would have to like schlep to the library, you know, using
Right.
DTC buses and all that stuff. And so I read like, I mean, anything and everything that I could get my hands on when I was young. Now, even when I was playing blackjack, to give you an idea, um, I had a very close relationship with books because my blackjack journey began with a book called $1 Million Blackjack by Ken Houston. So that was the starting point, and I used his method, and and the fact that he was arrested and beaten really outraged me and gave me the moral imperative to play this game. But beyond that, I went like this. The books you see behind me, a lot of them are blackjack books, and I decided that, I mean, books at the time cost $10-15 each, and I was happy to buy used ones. So I think in those 2-3 years, I've gone into every bookstore I could find and bought any book that they had on blackjack and bought it. So I read anything and everything that anyone had ever written on the subject of blackjack, in the hope that even a small negative information could improve my edge by 0.005%, and it would be worth it, because that
Right.
0.005% is for life. I mean, that's what I thought my
Mm.
life was going to be, right? So I had a very close relationship with books while I'm gambling as well. Now, another book, Liar's Poker, which talks about a blackjack player coming to Wall Street, but he also has a business degree from Harvard, which I obviously was never going to get, made me think about coming to Wall Street, and is partly responsible for my being here. However, I realized very quickly that unlike blackjack, there are no books to read on finance. Consequently, in 2-3 decades of working in this industry, I have not read a single finance book, because I knew that people who can invest and beat the market will just do that. People who can't might write books about how you can beat the markets, and I don't know of any successful investor who has genuinely given away their secrets for beating the market. I mean, yes, there's all sorts of, like even I have a chapter on how I trade the mortgage market. But as much as I've tried to explain how this market works to people, you can't read that chapter and figure out how to make money in mortgages. And actually, some of my friends in the mortgage market have actually complained about that, because they were hoping to find that out. So it's like a real dichotomy. In blackjack, I read everything I could find, and on Wall Street, I did not read a single book, because I
Right.
knew it was a waste of time, because the books will not teach me anything.
Right. I think you've picked up on a very interesting bit there, because I think, and again, this is just my personal opinion about these things. So what eventually happens is that, when it comes to like say finance books, right? Because I work in the field, I have read a few, and what I believe actually happens is most people who succeed on the street, right? They have ineffable qualities which actually go beyond being objectively quantified, right? For example, something as legendary as Mr. Buffett's patience, or your ability to kind of have the higher moral ground. As much as you might write about it, or Mr. Buffett might write about it, what people, when they turn to books, they're looking for like these objective tick marks to kind of go about working in these fields.
Right.
Right. And as much as you might provide them with some of them, these aren't, patience isn't like a tick mark that you can have on your book, or
No,
moral righteousness
can't.
isn't, it's a very difficult,
Or discipline, which is the most important quality. People just don't have
absolutely,
it.
absolutely. And those are the things that separate, like, I don't know, people who are, even if this rare instances when you're reading books by people who've actually beaten the street and done really well, and I know you're reading them or hearing them out, and you still can't seem to succeed. That's simply because you're not imbibing their soft qualities that they're. But yeah, again, that's just a very random thought that just
No,
came
it's
to my mind
actually
when
a
you were
pretty
talking.
astute observation because, an investor actually once asked me, like, you've been doing the same thing for so long, right? Successfully.
Mhm.
How come others haven't copied you? Because a good idea on Wall Street immediately gets copied. I said,
Yeah.
well, I can think of three reasons. Firstly, it took me 7 years to figure this market out. I mean, how many people do you know who are willing to toil away for 7 years trying to figure one problem, right? But
Yeah.
there is that one. But let's say you get beyond that hurdle and you figured it out. Secondly, it takes an extraordinary amount of hard work every single day to identify what is the right trade and to manage money appropriately and put it on. And it's not just a black box that you can just turn on. It takes a lot of thought and effort, a great deal of hard work every day. And let's say you can even do that, right? You figured out the method, you put in the hard work every day. I said the third component, which is the most important and the most critical, most people just do not have. And I learned it through while playing blackjack, which is discipline. Like no matter how good or bad the circumstances are, do you have the wherewithal to stay with your chosen system? And I can't tell you how many people I've met who just don't have that because a temporary loss or a not so temporary loss will just make them throw their hands in the air that it doesn't work. But if you've taken the time and patience, in my case, 7 years, to prove to yourself that the system does work, well, then you can stay with it. And, and even then, even with that knowledge, it takes an extraordinary amount of discipline. And I had that because I had seen what happens in casinos when I deviated from my system. So it sounds shocking, but in 20 years of managing money, not a single day have I deviated from my chosen system. Not once.
Yeah. Right. That's that, and it just reminds me of this. So it's something that you do right at the beginning of your book, right? When you start right now talking about your blackjack journey, you write about how your first instance was not a very happy one, like where you lost, and then you
Yes.
decide to, when you were honing your skill, you decide to keep your bets small until you
Very small.
doubled your
Yeah.
right until you doubled your capital, and then eventually you raised your stakes once you quadrupled your capital, and then you started to deploy your strategy after honing it and with discipline over time. That's the thing, right? I think these are rare qualities to imbibe. I don't think a lot of people would go down that path. They might just have something that your friend had experienced. I forgot which one.
Right. Exactly. Ajay.
Right, right, Ajay, right, yeah.
Right.
So, who just
Not his real
learn
name,
the
by the way.
strategy? Yeah, yeah, I'm sure. But
Yeah, it's like
like, I mean, that's what most people would do. They'll read a book or two. They'll just get that. Oh, this is the strategy. Oh, this is quite simple. Okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to go win and double my money or quadruple it. And that's where the lack of attention to discipline, I think, is the major problem there.
yeah, people don't realize I mean, anything worthwhile requires a lot of effort. And none of the people I knew back in San Francisco when I was trying to become this professional blackjack player, none of the people I knew ever saw the amount of effort that went into it.
Mm-hmm.
They would come on a trip with me to Reno or Las Vegas. They would see me counting cards and they would think it's easy. They
Right.
didn't see how many days and weeks and months I played 6 to 8 hours a day, every single day in the solitude of my apartment.
Right.
Nobody's around, so nobody sees that. And they just figured, it doesn't seem so difficult. I can do it. And I mean, the same principle applies to Wall Street. I mean, people think, people have tried to copy my strategy, over the years. And without exception, it has all turned out badly because they don't have the discipline or the thought process to stay with firstly, they may not have the correct method, which is what I do believe. So in which case,
Mm-hmm.
there is no hope to begin with. It may work out for a short while. At least in blackjack, you can get the method from a book.
So, in fact, it's a very interesting thing that you pointed out. I heard this anecdote a couple of days back itself, where when you were talking about how people did not see the hard work that went into it. So it's just a slightly longer story, but it goes along the line. There was this one machine which was really difficult to work, and there was just one engineer who could ever actually figure out how to repair it. So once when it wasn't working, the people decided to call that person to fix it. Person comes, he looks at the machine for like about 10-15 minutes, and he's like, just tighten that bolt and it'll start working. They do it. And when he's asked for a bill, he presents $1,000 bill and people are outraged. Like, I mean, you just asked us to tighten a
Yeah.
bolt and you're charging us. Can you give me an itemized thing? Like, sure. He gives him an 2-line item bill where the first item is tightening the bolt $1, knowing which bolt to tighten
What did I
990.
9,900? Yeah, exactly.
Right,
I
and
agree with that story completely.
right, and that's actually what it's all about. That the discipline and the time and the effort that you put into certain things, whether it's blackjack or whether it's Wall Street or whether, for that matter, when you came to you finishing your masters in a year. I mean, that story is also something. I mean, not that you
Yeah.
harped on it a lot, but I particularly found it very interesting that you saw computers as an escape to, like, not that you were
To
particularly
America.
love it,
Yeah.
but you saw it as an escape to America, and you just bulldozed your way through it with the strategy in mind,
Yes.
put in the effort with the discipline. Right. I mean, your friend Jaspal was also there, who decided not to go through with it. I'm
Right.
not too sure if he actually liked computers or he was on the same
No, he
boat as
loved
yours to
computers.
bulldoze.
He's
Right.
still in the computer
Right.
industry to this date. I mean,
Oh, really?
3.5 decades later. So he loved
Right.
computers, and he still thought the strategy I was pursuing was too risky. Because I've known a lot of very smart people at IIT, but many of them tend to be risk averse.
Right.
Whereas I've been willing to take risks where I felt the odds, maybe not necessarily the odds, but the risk reward was in my favor.
Right. So, Kamal, I must ask you this, right? What prompted you to write this book? I mean, you did mention that you weren't, like, you were no longer interested in finance, but what made you switch over? What was the trigger, if I can put it that way?
The trigger is actually the epilogue of the book.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you'll get to it soon enough.
Right.
What happened in spring of 2018, and I'm sort of giving away sort of the ending of the book, but it's not a great shock because I think the Bloomsbury blurb sort of points this out, up front. But in spring of 2018, I was hired by the same individual who hires me on page 1 of the book, or chapter 1 of the book, at a brand new startup hedge fund. It was called Exodus Point Capital. So I came on board because, I've known him for a quarter century. I said, sure, I'll come. And the first task for any startup hedge fund is to raise money. And, when I came on board, there was no office space. There were no investors. There was like a handful of employees, So early on, get some office space. And they asked me, can you help us with raising money? And I said, sure, but I've never done any marketing before, because if you look at any large hedge fund, whether it's Millennium or Brevin Howard or wherever I've worked over the years, they keep their two functions, raising money and investing it, completely separate. The two shall not mix. So investors, by and large, don't meet too many portfolio managers. But in this case, there was a need. So I said, sure, I'll do it, And then I thought about this is the first time I'm going down this path. And I thought, what should I tell these people? And I said, what can I tell them other than my own story? There's nothing else I can really offer them, right? And the story involves blackjack and my methodology in the mortgage market and the performance and all that stuff. But it's a story starting from electrical engineering to computer science to blackjack to mortgages and how I approach the market. And I actually have a line in the book which says, what is marketing if not the telling of a good story? I mean, if you think about what is marketing, it's just someone telling you a good story. So I do this. And to my great surprise, it goes remarkably well. So that now I become their go-to guy for these meetings. And I do this 10, 15 times with sitting across from investors that collectively controlled several $1 trillion with a T, And I just do the same thing over and over again. I just tell them my story and they have all sorts of questions, and those I handle in real time. Because, just like my interview at Lehman, when someone grills me on blackjack, when I'd lived, ate, and breathed blackjack for 2.5 years, right? You're not going to be able to ask me a question about the game that's going to throw me off, right? So I was able to handle them. Same thing with mortgages. I've spent 25 years in the mortgage market. It wasn't possible for anyone to ask me a question that I wouldn't be able to answer. So the meetings went fabulously well, and partly as a result of my efforts, in June of 2018, which was a few months later, the hedge fund launches as initially we thought we raise $1 billion or $2 billion, that'll be a lot, for a startup hedge fund. But then by June, we are turning people away, and it became the largest hedge fund launch in history with over $8 billion under management on day one. So now I'm thinking, okay, my story had such an incredible impact on all these random strangers that I'd never met before, right? Because my average meeting was me sitting on one side of a long conference room table and 5 to 7, strangers on the other side, right? And I'm just telling them my life story. And I said, if it sort of gave me an idea. I mean, I think, until then, I'd always been a storyteller. So I've always done that. But the stories had been only told to people that I knew personally, a small group of people. To seeing their effect on just random strangers that I'd never met before, I said, you know what? I must write a book so that I can share it with all the random strangers in the world and see what happens. So that's how it happened. It was, so June 1st was the launch of Exodus Point, and June 19th was the day I wrote down the first words.
Oh, that's very good. Like this, it's going to be your anniversary. Fourth year.
No, fourth year. June of 18.
Yes. June 18, right. No, that's, and again, it's a very remarkable quality that you brought up, like this ability to switch from something that you throw yourself completely into, realize there is a much larger goal or larger purpose that's beckoning you, and just switching over to that. That's just a remarkable quality that you've demonstrated. But Kamal, we've unfortunately come towards the end of the podcast. We're running out of time.
Okay.
So I have one actually question for you while we depart. You mentioned a couple of times that about your second book. What's that about? What are you writing your second book on? Can you give us a glimpse into that world?
Yeah, I can tell you what it is about. So there towards the end of the book, I devote 2 or 3, maybe 4 pages to this topic of negotiating. And as it turns out, over the last 20 some years, I've negotiated on behalf of countless number of people against large corporations. So, I don't know if my anti-corporate bent comes through in the book or not, but it's not a relevant big part of the book, but it's a big part of my life. And it's sort of how I went about dealing with these problems. To me, casinos were these big evil behemoths, so I'm going to teach them a lesson. I don't feel that differently about, big financial firms on Wall Street either. So that's why I'm playing this game, to beat the markets, right? And so there is this whole moral arc of fighting injustice. I believe corporate America is, and I think not just corporate America, but global corporations have treated the populations of the world very unfairly. And I fight against it by helping people negotiate against their corporate adversaries. And I've done this hundreds of times over the last 20 some years. And I have a distinct method of how I negotiate, which I even mentioned in the book. It's called The Opposite of Chess. Because the key to a successful business negotiation is a focus on one move at a time, and only one move at a time. Looking any further ahead than the next move in front of you is a waste of both time and effort. So the next book will recount my adventures as a shadow negotiator, because I'm always behind the scenes, right? Like it's the individual fighting against a corporation, and I'm just advising them. Right. And it's a story filled with numerous twists and turns. And the original title of Play It Right was actually Negotiating Wall Street, because it was about negotiating contracts and negotiating jobs for people, and my negotiating this world of high finance, for the two meanings of the word. But then I have the brilliant agent. He said, no, there are 2 books in here. One is just your journey, and then there is a book on negotiating. So the book 2, if it ever comes to pass, will be, I hope, basically a philosophy of negotiating, followed by stories that illustrate that philosophy.
Right. Well, I really do hope it comes to pass, because I absolutely enjoyed reading your first book, and not just your story, but the way you write is also a very interesting way of reading things. So I'm really looking forward to that second book as well. Not just
well, we'll see. I'm only 150 pages into it so far. Right. It's about halfway through.
Well, here's hoping the other half comes too soon. Thank you, Kamal. Thank you for doing this. This was absolutely lovely.
Thank you very much, Siddharth. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us today. Thank you so much. Sure.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please check us out on all our social media platforms. We're available across all podcasting platforms, on YouTube, on Instagram. You can find us at @Kitabi Karwan on Instagram, or just search Kitabi Karwan on Google or a platform of your choice and you'll find us. We carry out Instagram lives, giveaways, we talk about books, we talk to bibliophiles, talk to authors, and basically try and create a reader's world through all of our platforms. Do check us out and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.